After splurging on a premium economy seat for my 14-hour flight, I was looking forward to the extra comfort. The man next to me asked if I could switch seats with his wife, as they were on their honeymoon. When I learned her seat was far back in economy, I politely declined, explaining I had paid for my comfort. He and his new wife weren't pleased with my refusal, and their behavior quickly turned nasty. At first, the man seemed quite friendly and kind, and I never expected him to act the way he did. But as soon as he realized I wasn't going to switch seats with his wife, his entire demeanor changed. I said, "It's our honeymoon! Don't be so selfish," he snapped, and my mouth fell open in surprise before I bust out laughing. "Well, if it's your honeymoon, why didn't you book 2 premium seats instead of just 1?" I asked. The man angrily mumbled something in response. I wasn't about to give up my seat, but I did try to offer a solution. I suggested they switch seats every few hours so both could enjoy the premium experience, but he wasn't interested. He shot me a glare and scoffed. "What? You think I'm going to sit in those tiny, uncomfortable seats? I don't think so." Wondered what kind of man would let his wife suffer through something he couldn't handle himself, but it quickly became clear that we weren't going to get along anyway. So I put on my headphones and decided to ignore him, determined to enjoy the rest of my flight. I was really excited about this trip and wasn't going to let anyone ruin it. But an hour into the flight, just as I had dozed off, I woke up to something moving next to me. I opened my eyes and realized my neighbor had encroached on all of our extra space, pushing his backpack into my legroom. I wasn't about to let that slide. "Excuse me, sir. Here's your bag," I said, picking it up and handing it to him, gesturing for him to keep it in his own space. His reaction wasn't what I expected. He started yelling at me not to touch his belongings. I was caught off guard and noticed people around us giving me dirty looks. I tried to explain, but no one was listening anymore. The man shot me a nasty smirk, and I decided if he was going to be an asshole, I'd match his energy. I wasn't going to let him ruin my flight, so I planned to teach him a lesson. But I had no idea things would get much worse. After a while, I went to the bathroom, and when I returned, my seat was taken. I walked over to my seat and stood beside it, waiting for the woman sitting in it to acknowledge me. It was clear she was deliberately ignoring me. She and the man next to me were holding hands, and I realized this was his wife. "Congratulations on your marriage," I said with a smile, and she finally looked up at me, surprised. The woman thanked me with a smile, and I made some small talk while standing in the aisle. She complained about missing her husband back in economy, and they both laughed. I joined in, pretending not to care that she had taken my seat. Finally, after a few minutes, I politely told her I'd like to sit down, and her expression immediately changed. "Are you seriously going to send me back there?" she asked, and I just shrugged. "Not my problem," I replied. But this was not what they wanted to hear. She turned to her husband, whining, "Baba, are you really going to let this happen?" He tried to reason with me, but I just shook my head, insisting on getting back in my seat. After a few more failed attempts to persuade me, the woman made a big fuss and finally returned to her own seat. I sat down, and the man next to me, whose name I later learned was Donovan, gave me another angry look. "Thanks a lot, buddy," he said sarcastically. I decided to watch a movie and ignore him, but little did I know, he would go to great lengths to make my flight a nightmare. The man continued to complain under his breath and shot me dirty looks while we were seated. I could feel his irritation emanating like a palpable force as he glared at me for no apparent reason other than his own frustration. Each glance he threw my way seemed more venomous than the last, making me wonder when he would finally stop. His muttering was annoying, and I could sense this was just the beginning of a long flight. When the flight attendant came by with drinks and snacks, Donovan made sure to bump his elbow into me while reaching for his drink. It seemed like he did it on purpose, making sure I felt every nudge. "Excuse me," I said, but he just grunted, acting as though I was the one inconveniencing him. I decided not to escalate the situation further, even though it was starting to get on my nerves. A bit later, Donovan accidentally spilled his drink on my tray table, offering a half-hearted apology when I asked him to be more careful. "Sorry," he said with a smirk that didn't match his words. The liquid spread across my tray and onto my belongings. I tried to keep my cool, even though it was getting harder. I knew it was important not to let him get the reaction he seemed to be seeking. I tried to clean up the mess with napkins and keep my frustration in check. It wasn't easy, especially with Donovan watching me, silently mocking my efforts. I dabbed at the spilled drink, doing my best to prevent it from spreading further. Despite my annoyance, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that reacting wouldn't help. The last thing I wanted was to provoke another altercation on such a long flight. Despite my efforts to enjoy my movie, Donovan kept pressing buttons on his remote, causing noise and distracting me. Every few minutes, the sound of static or sudden volume changes would interrupt the film. I glanced at him, hoping he'd take the hint, but he seemed to revel in the chaos he was creating. Clearly, he was determined to make my flight as unbearable as possible. I clenched my teeth, trying to stay calm. I realized I was in for a long flight with him, wondering how I would survive the ordeal. The hours stretched out ahead of me, and every passing second felt heavier than the last. Donovan's antics showed no signs of stopping, and I couldn't help but feel trapped. I questioned my ability to maintain composure for the entire duration, but I knew losing my temper would only make things worse. Resigned, I braced myself. Trying to maintain my composure, I continued to ignore Donovan and focused on the movie. I turned up the volume, hoping to drown out the disturbances he was causing. Occasionally, I cast a wary glance in his direction, but I refused to let him see that he was affecting me. My determination to remain calm took every ounce of my willpower. No matter what, I was resolved to not let this bully ruin my entire flight. During the meal service, Donovan loudly complained about the lack of vegetarian options, hoping to gain sympathy from the flight attendants. His voice carried through the cabin, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "This is ridiculous!" he exclaimed. "How can they not have vegetarian meals?" He repeated his outbursts several times, clearly fishing for any reaction. I tried to focus on my own meal, but his complaints made it hard to enjoy anything. When he didn't get the reaction he wanted, he pushed his meal tray away, spilling the contents onto my seat and pants. The mess was immediate and uncomfortable, leaving me feeling frustrated and sticky. "Really?" I muttered, trying to control my anger. I looked over at Donovan, but he seemed indifferent. With a sigh, I knew I needed help to clean up and get back to some semblance of comfort during this chaotic flight. I calmly asked a flight attendant for extra napkins and a new meal, trying to keep my cool. "Could I please get some help with this?" I asked, pointing to the mess Donovan had created. The attendant nodded sympathetically and quickly gathered napkins and another meal for me. As I cleaned up, Donovan's gaze remained fixed on me, a smirk playing on his lips. I resisted the urge to snap back, focusing instead on salvaging what little comfort I could find. Donovan then accused me of deliberately taking up more space, even though I was seated properly. "Could you move over a bit?" he grumbled, nudging me unnecessarily. I shifted slightly, only to realize he wasn't satisfied. His dissatisfaction seemed endless, and it was clear that he was looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. As his complaints grew louder, I felt the other passengers' eyes turning toward us, and the air grew thick with tension. I pointed out quietly that he was the one spreading out into my area. "Donovan, you're taking up part of my seat," I said as calmly as I could. He ignored my comment and shifted even more into my space, making it clear he had no intention of being reasonable. His aggressive demeanor was unmistakable, and I wondered how far he was willing to push this petty confrontation. The tension between us was almost tangible. His anger grew, and he muttered about how unfairly they were being treated. "This is ridiculous," he said under his breath, but loud enough for me to hear. Each word seemed to stab at the already fragile peace between us. His frustration was evident, but it was rooted in his own unreasonable expectations. I tried my best to tune him out, but the constant muttering made it nearly impossible to relax. I knew this wasn't over. I could feel the tension rising, but I knew I had to maintain my composure and not escalate the situation further. Donovan's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, yet I reminded myself that reacting angrily wouldn't help. Every muscle in my body was tensed as I made a conscious effort to remain calm. This flight was proving to be a real test of patience, and I was determined not to let it break me. As the flight continued, Donovan invaded my personal space even more by stretching his legs out and hitting my feet. "Can you give me some space?" I asked, trying to stay polite. He just looked at me with a blank expression and made no effort to move. His legs continued to encroach into my space, making it clear he didn't care about my comfort. His disregard for boundaries was getting increasingly harder to ignore. When I politely asked him to move, he refused and started talking loudly to his wife across the aisle. "Hey, honey, can you believe this guy?" he said loudly, ensuring that everyone around could hear. His voice boomed across the cabin, and I could see heads turning in our direction. Despite my efforts to keep things calm, Donovan seemed determined to draw as much attention as possible. This was quickly turning into a scene. Other passengers who were trying to rest began to take notice of his loud talking. People around us shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly annoyed by the disturbance. A few exchanged looks of frustration, silently pleading for some peace and quiet. Donovan's voice cut through the cabin's ambient noise, making it impossible for anyone nearby to get any rest. The more he talked, the more I realized he had no intention of simmering down. Flight attendants came by to calm Donovan down, but he claimed I was causing all the problems. "It's him," Donovan said, pointing at me. "He's been bothering me the entire flight." The flight attendants looked at me for an explanation, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Donovan's confident accusations seemed to throw them off. I couldn't believe his audacity, lying so blatantly, and I had to decide how to handle this next. I couldn't believe his audacity, but decided not to confront him directly. Instead, I chose to let the situation play out without adding fuel to the fire. Arguing would only create more chaos, and I had no desire to turn this into an even larger spectacle. Donovan seemed to feed off the attention, and I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. It felt like remaining silent was my best option, at least for now. Instead, I documented everything that was happening on my phone, thinking the evidence might come in handy later. I took discreet photos and jot down notes every time Donovan acted out. This way, if things got worse, I'd have solid proof to back up my side of the story. While it didn't solve the immediate problem, having a record gave me a sense of control in an otherwise powerless situation. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. Knowing a confrontation would make things worse, I chose to focus on documenting each incident instead. I observed Donovan's every move, making sure to record the times he acted out. This way, if things escalated further, I'd have an indisputable account of his behavior. While it was frustrating to sit there and tolerate his antics, I knew that having evidence might prove useful later on. My phone became my shield against his incessant harassment. Hours into the flight, I noticed Donovan passing notes to his wife and giving me smug looks. Their eyes met mine with a gleam of mischief, and I had a sinking feeling they were plotting something. My resolve to stay calm and collected grew stronger as I documented each exchange. People's patience around us was starting to thin as well, and I hoped their antics wouldn't make more enemies around. At one point, Donovan's wife threw a small paper ball over my head, hitting me on the cheek. The unexpected impact startled me, and I felt a surge of irritation. Turning to see her giggling response only added to my frustration. I picked up the paper ball and held it in my hand for a moment, considering my options. Confronting her directly seemed pointless, but I made sure to document this childish act. I looked back at her, incredulous. She just giggled and turned away, clearly entertained by her antics. Her laughter felt like nails on a chalkboard. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, but I fought to keep it in check. It was clear they were trying to get a rise out of me. Instead of reacting, I took a deep breath and added this incident to my growing list of grievances. Fed up, I decided to speak to a flight attendant and explain the entire situation. I stood up and approached the nearest attendant. "Excuse me, can I speak with you for a moment?" I asked. They nodded, so I shared everything that had been happening. I described Donovan's actions and his wife's involvement, emphasizing the constant harassment. The attendant listened attentively, expressing concern. It felt good to have someone finally take me seriously. I showed the flight attendant a few of the notes I had managed to intercept. Each note contained petty remarks and rude comments aimed at making my flight difficult. The attendant's eyebrows furrowed as they read through them, and I could see the wheels turning in their mind. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," they said. "We'll speak with Donovan and his wife immediately." For the first time, I felt like justice might be served. The flight attendant assured me they would speak to both Donovan and his wife. It was somewhat reassuring, knowing that their behavior wouldn't go unchecked. "We take this kind of behavior seriously," they added. I nodded, grateful for their intervention. As I returned to my seat, I couldn't help but hope that this conversation would finally put an end to the relentless harassment. Still, I remained cautious, ready to document any new developments. However, the couple's behavior only slightly improved after the conversation with the flight attendant. Donovan and his wife seemed to tone down their antics, but continued to exchange smug looks and whispers. Their subtle provocations persisted, a reminder that they weren't completely deterred. Despite the minor improvement, I stayed vigilant, phone in hand, ready to capture any further harassment. It was a small victory, but I knew the battle wasn't over. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, turbulence hit, causing Donovan's drink to spill all over again. The plane shook, and before I knew it, liquid splashed out of his cup. This time, the spill was even messier, soaking through the seat pocket and onto the floor. Donovan's careless grip contributed to the chaos, and his reaction was one of mild inconvenience, as if nothing unusual had happened. I sighed in exasperation. This time, the drink drenched the seat pocket and some of my carry-on items. I scrambled to wipe everything down, my frustration mounting with each fumble. My belongings were wet, and I struggled to prevent further damage. Donovan showed no remorse, his indifference only adding fuel to my irritation. I flagged down another flight attendant and pointed out the recurring pattern. They sympathized, but indicated their hands were tied, unless the behavior turned outright aggressive. Angrily, I wiped down everything and asked another flight attendant for assistance. The frustration in my voice was evident, but they only offered a sympathetic nod. "I'm really sorry about this," I said, pointing to the drenched seat pocket and my soaked carry-on items. The flight attendant handed me more napkins, but the damage was done. I was beginning to lose hope that this situation would ever improve. I pointed out that the spills were becoming a pattern, seeking the attendant's help in addressing the issue. "This keeps happening," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "There must be something you can do." The attendant scanned the situation, their expression empathetic but constrained. It felt like Donovan was deliberately trying to push me to my breaking point, and I was desperately looking for some sort of intervention. The attendant sympathized, but said there wasn't much they could do unless the behavior became more aggressive. "We're really sorry, but unless it escalates, our hands are tied," they said apologetically. I sighed, feeling the weight of my frustration. While their sympathy was appreciated, it did little to resolve the ongoing harassment. Donovan's continuous antics and deliberate provocations loomed over me like a dark cloud, souring the entire flight experience. As the flight went on, I kept feeling Donovan's elbow in my side and his foot tapping against mine. It felt like a deliberate invasion of my personal space, each jab and nudge more frustrating than the last. "Could you please stop?" I asked, but my plea fell on deaf ears. He ignored me completely, making it impossible to relax. I felt trapped alongside a man who seemed intent on making my journey unbearable. Exhausted, I sighed and tried to tune him out, hoping the ordeal would soon be over. Each nudge and tap felt like a reminder of how long this flight still had to go. I glanced at my watch, but time seemed to inch forward at a snail's pace. I closed my eyes and took a few deep breaths, trying to center myself and hold on to some semblance of patience. The journey felt interminable. With only a few hours left in the flight, I noticed Donovan getting into an altercation with another passenger. The tension in the air was palpable as the other passengers struggled with their overhead bin, and Donovan inserted himself into the situation. The altercation drew the attention of nearby passengers and created an early buzz of discomfort. I watched warily, wondering just how far Donovan would push his luck this time. The other passenger had trouble accessing the overhead bin, and Donovan aggressively shoved their belongings to make more room. "Hey, watch it!" the other passenger snapped, their frustration mirrored by those of us watching. Donovan remained unfazed, continuing to rearrange the items with a sense of entitlement. I could sense that this confrontation was escalating quickly, and I braced myself for another round of drama-fueled chaos. This caused a heated exchange that required flight attendants to intervene once again. "Calm down, sir," one attendant urged as Donovan raised his voice. "He's blocking my space," Donovan retorted, his tone growing more belligerent by the second. The other passenger fired back, emotions flaring on both sides. Flight attendants did their best to defuse the situation, but it was clear that Donovan thrived on the attention and chaos he created. Trying to avoid further drama, I focused on the in-flight entertainment. I put my headphones back on and attempted to disengage from the chaos around me. The movie flickered on the screen, and I tried to lose myself in its story, hoping to escape Donovan's relentless disruptions for at least a short while. My determination to find some peace and quiet felt like an uphill battle, but I clung to it nonetheless. Yet, Donovan continually talked over the movie, making it hard to enjoy. His loud, unwelcome commentary invaded my ear space, adding to the list of grievances. "Can you believe how ridiculous this is?" he said to no one in particular. Passengers nearby exchanged exasperated glances. I cranked up the volume on my headphones, but his voice still managed to seep through. It felt like Donovan was determined to ruin every attempt I made at finding solace. I realized I needed to come up with a final plan to put an end to Donovan's harassment. Clearly, staying calm and ignoring him wasn't going to work. His antics were getting more aggressive, and it was obvious he wouldn't stop unless forced to. I racked my brain for a solution, knowing that if I didn't act soon, this nightmare flight would feel even longer than it already did. Determined, I thought through my options while trying to avoid any more confrontations. I needed a plan that would hold Donovan accountable without escalating the situation further. Documenting everything had helped so far, but I knew there had to be a more immediate solution. While Donovan continued his disruptive antics, I rehearsed my strategy for getting the flight attendants involved in a way they couldn't ignore. As the flight attendants announced the descent for landing, Donovan began boasting loudly about his honeymoon. "This is my honeymoon, can you believe it?" he exclaimed to no one in particular. His voice carried through the cabin, drawing irritated glances from other passengers. I knew I had to act fast before we landed. His loud declarations only strengthened my resolve. I couldn't let his behavior go unchallenged any longer. I had had enough and decided to take action before we landed. No way was I going to let Donovan ruin the final stretch of this flight without facing any consequences. I mentally ran through the steps I needed to take, feeling a sense of determination growing within me. My final plan included giving the flight attendants all the evidence I had collected, ensuring they understood the extent of his harassment. Waiting for the flight attendants to be closer, I presented all my notes detailing Donovan's continual harassment. "Excuse me," I said, catching their attention. "I need to show you something important." As I handed over my documented evidence, I explained each incident, making sure they understood the ongoing issues. The attendants nodded, their expressions growing more serious as they reviewed the notes and photos I had taken throughout the flight. The attendants took my information seriously, deciding to monitor the couple closely. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," one of them said. "We'll keep an eye on them and make sure this behavior stops." Their assurance was a relief, and I finally felt like someone was on my side. As they moved away, I watched them approach Donovan and his wife, ready to put an end to their antics. As the plane touched down and passengers began to disembark, I prepared for my last move. Gathering my belongings, I took a deep breath and steeled myself for the final confrontation. With the evidence in hand and the flight attendants on alert, I felt more confident. This was my chance to ensure Donovan faced the consequences of his actions. The end was in sight, and I was ready to see it through. I knew I needed to ensure Donovan faced consequences for his actions. The flight attendants were already watching him, but I wanted to do more. As I followed the stream of disembarking passengers, I rehearsed my next steps in my mind. Donovan's smug demeanor seemed to deflate slightly, indicating he might have sensed what was coming. Regardless, I was determined. It was time to take this to the airline's customer service. Gathering my belongings, I steeled myself for the final confrontation after the flight. The anticipation of what was about to unfold sent a surge of energy through me. Donovan's behavior needed to be addressed properly, and I was going to make sure it happened. The flight attendants had seen what happened, but now it was time to present my case to the airline staff on the ground. Justice was within reach. After disembarking, I approached the airline's customer service desk with all the documented evidence of Donovan and his wife's harassment. "I need to report an issue from the flight," I said firmly. The staff listened attentively as I presented the photos and notes I had taken. Their expressions shifted to horror as they realized the extent of what I had endured. They assured me that the matter would be addressed immediately. I calmly explained the situation in detail, showing the staff the photos and notes I had taken during the flight. Each image and comment painted a clear picture of the harassment I had endured. As they reviewed my evidence, I made sure to highlight the most egregious actions. The staff's growing concern was evident, and I felt a sense of validation. Finally, I wasn't alone in dealing with Donovan's unruly behavior. The airline staff were horrified and assured me they would address the issue immediately. "This is unacceptable," one of them said, shaking their head in disbelief. They apologized for the distress I had experienced and promised that Donovan's behavior would not go unpunished. Their stern expressions and swift actions were reassuring, making me feel that justice would be served. I left the desk, grateful for their prompt response. As I left, I saw Donovan and his wife being pulled aside by security for a conversation that didn't look pleasant. Their faces, once smug and arrogant, now appeared worried and defensive. I watched from a distance as the security officer spoke to them, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. For the first time since the flight began, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. By standing up to them and documenting their behavior, I ensured they couldn't bully others on future flights. The evidence I had collected was now in the hands of the airline, and I felt confident that measures would be taken. Other passengers wouldn't have to endure what I had, and that gave me a sense of accomplishment. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one nonetheless. The most satisfying moment came when I learned that Donovan was downgraded to economy class for the return flight. This consequence was a perfect response to his appalling behavior. Knowing he wouldn't enjoy the same comforts he had sought to sabotage for me was gratifying. His demotion was a testament to the power of speaking up and taking action. Justice had been served above 10,000 feet. It was a fitting end to a long and challenging journey, and I felt a sense of justice served. As I walked through the airport, my steps felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of unresolved conflict. The ordeal had tested my patience and resolve, but in the end, standing my ground had paid off. The satisfaction of knowing Donovan faced consequences made the entire ordeal worthwhile. As I reached the airport exit, I reflected on the ordeal and the importance of standing up against bullying. The experience had taught me a valuable lesson about the power of documenting and reporting bad behavior. While the flight had been anything but peaceful, the resolution brought a sense of closure. I knew I had done the right thing by not letting Donovan's bullying go unchecked. Knowing that Donovan and his wife faced consequences, I felt a sense of closure. The relief washed over me like a wave, and I could finally breathe easy. The couple's smug attitude had been replaced with worry and uncertainty, a fitting outcome for their relentless harassment. As I continued my journey, I carried the inner peace that came from standing up for myself and ensuring justice was served. Despite the nightmare flight, I felt vindicated, ready to enjoy the rest of my trip in peace. The storm had passed, and the skies ahead looked clear. As I exited the airport, I looked forward to the adventures that awaited me, free from the shadow of Donovan's bullying. The memory of my perseverance and final victory would be a reminder of the strength within, ready to face whatever came next.